A friend of mine who works out at Arlington National Cemetery saw my site and handed me a box with a flag and a certificate. He said, "You're pretty creative, see what you can do with this." I looked around the garage to see what I had to work with, and I pulled out an 8x3 oak strip of wood and some leftover backing from a previous shadow box. I start by measuring one side of the top half of the ensign. The angle should be 90 degrees. With that measurement, I cut two pieces. They don't have to be perfect, just not smaller than your measurement. From here I will be using my framing jig. If you didn't see my earlier video on how to make this jig, click below. So now using my jig, I clamp a piece of wood to mark the measurement I took earlier, and I cut my ends so I have perfect 90-degree angles. I go back to my ensign and check that my pieces fit properly. Taking the two pieces I just cut, I go back to the table saw and cut my glass groove, about 1/4 of an inch down from the top and 1/4 inch deep. Now, with the top two pieces placed together, measure the base. This will be the length of your box. Ensure it is larger than your certificate. With that measurement, cut two more pieces. The base piece is longer than my jig, so I will use an extra piece of wood to extend out the fence on my jig. The jig just makes corners easy, and it saves you a lot of time. Repeat this process for the sides and your frame should be coming together. After all your pieces are cut, lay them out and check that all your cuts are 90 degrees. This won't be an issue if you used your framing jig. Okay, so for the lower portion of the box, use one of your top pieces and reset your glass track and make your cuts. Alright, mistake 1. Remember how I always say that I make this up as I go along? Well, here's my first hurdle. With the 1/4 inch glass groove cut on the top inside of the rectangle, I cannot cut the same on the opposite side or I will cut the piece into two pieces. So a quick change of plans here, and I will turn all of the glass groove cuts into the back plate relief. This way I will save the wood and I will figure out something else for the glass. So take all your pieces back to the table saw, set your 1/4 inch depth and width, and cut out the back plate relief. Kinda looks like we meant to do this. They turned out nice, didn't they? I intend to cut the center piece to half of its normal width, without cutting off the ends, so I leave the ends at their full size. I put on my dado blade to save some time. This will make sense when you see the pieces put back together. This is how I plan on overcoming my glass notch mistake. So now take a close look. The center piece is thinner than the rest of the pieces, but still has a full size on both its ends, and has a continuous back plate relief. Now to cut your back plate. Grab your tape measure and take a measurement across the frame from relief to relief, both top and bottom. Don't worry about angles yet, let's just cut out the square. Using any straight edge, make your mark and then take it to the table saw. Take the rectangle piece you just cut and go back and make your marks for your angles. Pencil them in and take them back to the table saw. If all went well, you should have a nice snug fit. Here's how I plan on overcoming the glass screw up. I will use the technique I used when I built the Texas shadow box. It worked great. I will build a small lip around the face of the box to hold the glass. Click the link below to see the Texas shadow box. To start, I will need a small thin piece of the same type of wood I am using. Before I cut it, I run it through the planer a few times just to make it a little thinner, but this step is optional. Once I think it is thin enough, I just eyeball the center and cut the piece in half, and then recut to make sure both sides are the same width. Before we start cutting the pieces of the faceplate, let's join our box together. I intend to glue these and put a brad in them if needed. So with some wood glue, I start by setting the corners of the rectangle. While the glue is drying, I take the center piece and start to sand it. This will become more difficult when the box is put together. So it only makes sense to do it now while we are waiting for the glue to dry. Now that your rectangle is dry, we can cut the first piece of the faceplate. Lay it on the face of the frame and from underneath make a mark to cut your piece. Then go back to your framing jig and cut your angles. Grab another 2 pieces and go ahead and cut the top of your Ensign frame while you're at it. So keep taking your pieces, make your marks, and take it back to the table saw. And just keep repeating this step by step until you've actually framed out the entire faceplate. Okay, before we make the cuts on the upper portion, we need to actually join the upper portion to the rest of the frame. So let's stop here and go ahead and do that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some wood glue and I'm just going to clamp the frame down, set the actual angle piece in place, and make sure the clamps are nice and tight, and put a couple of brads in it just to hold it in. And once the glue sets, it'll be strong enough for anything, so the brads are just really to hold it in place. And so I'm just going to repeat this process to both sides. The brads are pretty small, so it's not really big, it's just to hold it in place. So wipe off any excess glue and then just let it sit for a little bit. Okay, so once it is dry, you come back in about an hour, it should be good and set. Take it to the sanding board, and what you want to do is just focus on the face of the actual frame. And what you're trying to do is buff out any of the rough edges that would cause a rise in your faceplate. So you want all your joints to be nice and smooth. So just go ahead and hit it with a rough sand, probably about a 120, until you can get all the little nooks and crannies smoothed out. And then we'll start attaching our faceplate. So here I still have to make the final cuts for my top pieces. Those are the only pieces left that I haven't cut. So I lay them into place, I take my pencil and I just make my marks. And then I'll quickly take them back to the framing jig or to the miter saw, whichever is the cut needs, and I'll make my cuts. Okay, so now we're going to start applying our faceplate to the actual frame. So lay down a bead of glue at the bottom of the rectangle. We're going to start at the bottom. And so once you have that bead of glue on, take your first piece and start clamping it to the frame. Now don't clamp it too tight or it'll actually slide on you. You want to just get it snug enough so it'll sit still. And then when you can get more on, you just take your time and clamp each one down tighter and tighter. Make sure you squeeze out as much glue as possible. And you want this piece to be flush with the outside to create as much lip on the inside as possible. Okay, notice when I'm setting this last piece in, I actually cut it a little bit larger than it is. There's a little bit of a lip left hanging over the edge when I set this in place. And that's perfectly alright because we will be trimming these up at the table saw if there's anything left over. You want to reduce sanding as much as possible. But for this, go ahead and let it hang over, put it in place, and crank it down. Okay, we're just going to keep repeating these steps until we get all the pieces on. Notice that once I lay my bead of glue down, I smooth it out with my finger. I don't want it to clump up or not have glue in any specific spot when I clamp it down. Okay, and then I'm using a small board just to make sure I'm flush with the outside edge. But notice I haven't even cut the inside piece for my piece that goes across the center of the frame. That's because I'll probably need both a miter cut and to use the framing jig to cut that piece. And I want to make sure that it's really tight fit when I actually make the cut. So I haven't even measured it yet, so it'll be the last piece that I cut. As you can see, both of the side pieces extend well past the frame, but that's okay. Like I said earlier, we're going to use the table saw to cut those flush. Okay, once those are all on, flip it over, take a small flathead screwdriver, and just clean out some of the glue that's oozed out. Make sure it's like workable so when you get all the clamps off you can get anything that's smaller. Okay, so now we're going to take the measurement for the centerpiece. The centerpiece has two different angles on it, one from the top cross and the other from the side straights. And so what we're going to do is we're going to mark those straights first, and we're going to take them to the miter saw. And then after we have those cut, from a halfway point we're going to mark the center of it, and we're going to take it directly to the framing jig and make sure we get those perfect 45-degree angles cut. So going back to your frame, why this works so well, as long as you have the sides cut first and you have a nice tight fit, you can always push the piece up hard to make it flush with the rest of the angled pieces. So here I'm going to go ahead and apply my glue, stick it in, and push it up, and we're going to clamp it down and let this baby sit overnight. Okay, so your last step is just to keep rotating around and clamping down and making sure everything's really tight. And then once that's all clamped down, you can just let it sit, and we'll come back tomorrow and take a look at it. Okay, so taking the clamps off, I can see that there's the standard little pressure points left on it by the clamps. That's fine, those will sand out easy. My main concern is once I get it all apart that I have a really strong, sturdy frame here that I can work with. Alright, so now grab your back plate, make sure it still fits and you don't need to adjust it. And then go ahead and flip it back over, take a pencil. What you want to do is draw a perimeter inside onto your back plate. So this will help you cut your glass later. Okay, so flip your box back over, take a flathead screwdriver, and make sure you clear out any imperfections that would keep the glass from lying flat in the lip. Okay, so I'm just going to take a light sand to the faceplate right now to check for any imperfections, and I'm going to sand away all the little pressure points that were left by the clamps. They come out really easy. Alright, so take your frame back over to the table saw and go ahead and bring your blade up all the way past the top of the frame. This will help you control your blade a lot better when you're cutting off the two pieces that were extended beyond on your faceplate. At this point, look around your box as well, and if you've screwed up any of the faceplate where it's actually hanging off more, go ahead and take a table saw to it. This will save you a lot of time when sanding. But if it's pretty much flush like it should be if you used a board to set it, then you should be good to go. Okay, so now on to the part that most people hate. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start sanding. So at first you're going to use 60, which is the rough cut, and then you're going to go to 100, and this will allow you to get more off, and then you're going to do that fine smooth finish with 120. So this is going to take a long time, so take your time and just keep sanding and do all three steps using each level of sandpaper on the entire box. And when you're done, you'll have a really good product. Out of all the steps in the making of this box, I spent the most time sanding. The more you sand, the better your product will be. Okay, so I bought an 18 by 24 piece of glass for this project. Usually I don't use glass because I always screw it up. I use plexiglass, but since these pieces are going to be so small, I figured I could get away with it. So I just take my measurements, I take a grease pencil, I mark my glass, I make my cuts, and I go ahead and break my glass. Since they're so small, I didn't really screw this up, but I did cross my fingers each time I went to snap the glass. I cut out my corner piece first, and I went ahead and used the natural 90-degree angle of the glass for my top corner. Okay, just so I don't cut myself later, I take my piece of glass over to the sanding board and I sand just the edges of it so they're rounded and beveled. That way I won't cut myself later when I'm trying to put the glass in or using it to cut templates or anything like that. I use the same process for the lower half of the box. This is just a rectangle piece, so I cut the larger piece first and then I cut one down for the second. As you see, even in the process of cutting this on a flat surface, I broke some of the glass. That's why I usually like to stick with plexiglass. So here I'm going to cut the smaller portion, and then I'm going to check my fit. Okay, I got lucky with my glass cuts and they actually fit pretty nicely. For this box, I intend to use dark honey stain. I'm hoping that this will bring out the darker parts of the wood. As with all my stain jobs, I just use paper towels. It's easy to apply and allows you to keep from leaving any streaks, and it'll also clean up as a breeze. There's nothing special about the way I stain, I just rub it on. This is where you find out if you spent enough time sanding. If you did, your box will start to look fantastic as you see the stain soak in. After you allow your box enough time to go ahead and dry, we're going to apply a small layer of polyurethane. That'll give it that glow, that glistening look. So it'll also bring out any of the other wood grain that you haven't noticed already. Okay, so while the polyurethane is drying, we're going to go ahead and countersink our holes for the back plate so we can attach that. So here I'm just choosing which countersink I'm going to use out of the 4 choices. I just pick one that is the exact same width of the top of the head of the screw, and I put it in my drill bit. This doesn't even have to be on the back of the box at the time. You just need to go ahead and countersink your holes just so the tops of the screw heads will be flush with the back of the board once you install them. Okay, this next step is so your flag really pops and looks perfect. So what I do is I just take an old scrap piece of plexiglass here and I'm going to cut it into a triangle, and I use that back plate as a template. Remember, we drew pencils on it. And so all I'm going to do is stick that inside the folded frame. Then you can jostle it around and move your stars so they perfectly align, and that'll also make it lay flush. So once you push it up against the glass, it'll be flat and the flag will look perfect. For the certificate, I cut out some blue matting to compensate for the extra space on the sides. If I had to do this over again, I would have chosen a darker blue to closer match the color of the flag. After I laid the certificate and the matting in place, I wanted to cut a piece of cardboard to go behind both. I grabbed what I had laying around in the garage and quickly cut out the shape of the rectangle. So now I had to compensate for the space between the cardboard and the back plate to ensure the certificate would not move once I sealed the box. Okay, so if you saw my headboard video, you will chuckle because you will know where I got this foam from. But 2 little pieces cut and put in place will apply enough pressure to the picture and the glass to keep them from moving once the back plate is installed. If you missed my headboard video, click below and you can see it later. Okay. So now put your back plate in place and screw into position. Take your time to ensure you don't apply too much pressure as you screw it down so you don't crack your back plate. The last step is to install the hanging bracket. I found one with the nails already in place. This should make installation a lot easier. This is the first time I've used one like this. I simply nailed it into place and now the box is complete. So screw-ups aside, I think it was pretty easy and your average do-it-yourselfer can pull this one off. I think it turned out great. Tell me what you think. I would love to hear your comments below, and have a happy Memorial Day. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button.